You ever wake up one morning and realize that there's no one waiting for you anymore? That thought came to me just before sunrise today, when the kettle started to whistle, and I watched the steam rise like a ghost against the window. The frost outside was thick enough to blur the houses across the street. Everything looked still. Too still. Some mornings feel heavier than others, don't they? Like time itself is tired of moving. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. The house was quiet, except for the old clock ticking on the wall. It belonged to my husband, George. He's been gone 12 winters now. Funny how you think you'll get used to the silence after someone passes. You never do. It only learns new ways to fill the room. I used to fill the silence too. If something broke, I fixed it. If someone needed help, I showed up. That was my way of staying useful. You know, telling myself that if I kept giving, maybe I wouldn't be forgotten. Silly, I suppose, but that's what I believed for most of my life. George used to say I had a soft heart with no brakes. He was right. When Clara, our daughter, went off to university, she needed extra money for her studies. I sold my wedding ring and his old pocket watch to help her. I told her I'd saved up, but the truth is I hadn't. I couldn't bear to see her struggle the way we did when we were young. If you're still here, welcome to Voice of Jenna, a place where stories aren't just told, they're felt. Here, we dive into real emotions, family drama, quiet heartbreaks, unexpected twists, and the moments that change us. So sit back, relax, and let me tell you what happened next. She used to call every Sunday. Then her job got busier, the calls stopped, and now I only hear from her at Christmas, maybe Easter if she remembers. I don't blame her. That's how life goes, doesn't it? People move, people change. But sometimes I still wait, tea in hand, hoping the phone will ring. There's one sacrifice I still don't talk about much. Years ago, before George passed, I had a chance to train as a teacher. I loved the idea, helping children read their first words, being part of something bright. But Mum fell ill, and she needed someone at home. I told myself, family first. So I stayed. I've spent my whole life telling myself that, family first. But what happens when family drifts away? Who are you left to be then? I sighed and looked out the window again. The world outside looked painted in shades of gray, the kind of morning that makes you pull your cardigan tighter, even indoors. I thought about staying in, but something inside me itched a little. Maybe it was the quiet, or maybe it was the way the frost on the glass looked like little feathers, reminding me there were still beautiful things out there. So I told myself, go for a walk, Margaret. Just a short one. The air will do you good. I reached for my coat, an old wool one with a missing button, and wrapped my scarf around twice. My boots had seen better days. The leather cracked when I bent to tie them. I smiled a little. George bought them for me on our 30th anniversary. He said, they'll keep your feet warm when I can't. I never imagined how true that would become. Before I left, I looked at his photo on the shelf, him in his gardening hat, that lopsided grin of his. Just a short walk, I whispered, like he could still hear me. I'll be back soon. Outside, the wind bit at my cheeks. The sky hung low, heavy with soft flakes that hadn't quite decided to fall yet. My breath came out in tiny clouds, and the street was empty, just the hum of a distant bus and the crunch of my boots on the pavement. I passed Mrs. Fowler's bookshop, lights off, signs swaying slightly in the wind, and nodded toward the bakery that used to smell like warmth itself. Everything felt smaller now. Even the park ahead, where I used to meet George after his shift, looked like a faded photograph. When I reached the gates, I hesitated. The cold seeped right through my coat, but I stepped inside anyway. Part of me just wanted to remember what it felt like to belong somewhere, even if it was only to the snow and silence. You know how memories come to you when you least expect them? I looked at the frozen pond and suddenly saw George skating there, waving his arms like a clown just to make me laugh. The memory stung, the way good ones sometimes do. I kept walking until I reached our old bench, the one by the oak tree. That's when I saw him. A man, hunched over, sitting on the far end of the bench, wrapped in a thin coat that wasn't nearly enough for this kind of cold. His head was bowed, his hands bare, and even from a distance, I could tell he was shivering. Something about the sight made my steps slow. For a moment, I thought maybe he was just resting, but he didn't move. Not once. The snow around his shoes looked untouched, like he'd been sitting there a long while. I don't know why, but my heart gave that small tug it always does when someone looks lost. I told myself, don't get involved, Margaret. This isn't your problem. But, you know me. I've never been very good at walking away. I stood there for a moment longer, the wind whispering through the bare branches above me. Then I noticed something that made my breath catch. The man's feet weren't even covered. No shoes. Just thin, torn socks pressed against the ice. And that's how it began. That's how everything changed. On a frozen morning when I thought I had nothing left to give. He didn't look up when I first walked closer. The man on the bench just sat there, shoulders hunched, hands tucked beneath his arms like he was trying to hold himself together. I stopped a few feet away, not wanting to startle him. Cold morning, I said softly. No answer. Not even a nod. For a moment, I thought I should just keep walking. Strangers are simpler that way. But then I saw his socks again, wet against the snow, and something inside me ached. You know that kind of ache that isn't quite sadness, but more a pull like your heart recognizes another broken thing? That's how it felt. I took a slow step forward. Are you all right there? Nothing. Just the quiet scrape of wind moving across the frozen path. I hesitated, then sat down on the far end of the bench. The wood burned cold through my coat. I know it's not much comfort, I said, half to myself, but it's freezing out here. He gave a tiny nod, still staring at the ground. His voice, when it came, was rough, barely a whisper. It's colder somewhere else. I didn't know what that meant, but it was enough for me to pull my scarf tighter and really look at him. His hair was unkempt but clean, and though his coat was threadbare, it wasn't the kind of rags I'd seen on the street. His face, tired, drawn, looked like someone who used to belong somewhere. You don't have shoes, I said quietly. You'll lose your toes like that. He smiled a little, almost amused. Doesn't matter much. There was something in the way he said it, not careless, not dramatic, just empty. And that emptiness frightened me more than anything. Before I could think twice, I bent down and untied my boots. My fingers stung as I pulled them off, the cold biting deep into my stockings. Here, I said, sliding them toward him. They're a bit worn, but warm. He looked at me as though I'd just done something strange. You'll freeze. I've been colder, I said. And that was the truth. For a second, he didn't move. Then slowly, he took the boots and slipped them on. They fit almost perfectly. His shoulders lifted, as if the weight of the cold eased just a little. Thank you, he whispered. Don't thank me, I said, forcing a smile. It's just kindness. The world needs more of it. He lowered his head again, murmuring something I almost didn't catch. It sounded like, you have no idea. When I turned to leave, I thought I saw tears in his eyes, but I didn't look back. I walked home barefoot, every step sharp and biting. Funny thing is, the pain didn't bother me much. The quiet inside did. For once, it wasn't the sort that came from loneliness, it was the sort that comes when something inside begins to wake up. Halfway home, I passed Mrs. Temple outside the post office. She looked me up and down, eyes landing on my bare feet. Good heavens, Margaret Ellison, she clucked. What on earth happened to your boots? Oh, just gave them to someone who needed them more, I said evenly. Her eyebrows jumped. You'll catch your death out here, being soft as ever. Haven't you learned people take advantage? I gave her a small nod. Maybe. But kindness doesn't cost as much as people think. She muttered something about foolish old women as she disappeared inside. I let it slide. People like Mrs. Temple never understood that sometimes giving wasn't about being thanked, it was about remembering who you are. As I turned the corner, old Mr. Webb from across the street called out from his porch, You walking home barefoot now, Margaret? Tryin' a new fashion? He laughed, not unkindly, but the sound still stung. Just helping someone out, I said, pretending it didn't hurt. When I finally reached my door, the skin on my feet was red and numb. I stood there for a moment before stepping inside, partly from exhaustion, partly from the strange comfort blooming in my chest. I hadn't felt useful in so long. It felt right. That night, as I sat by the small heater, I thought of the man again. The way he said, "It's colder somewhere else." I wondered what he'd meant. Maybe he'd lost someone too. Maybe the cold he spoke of wasn't in his hands, but in his heart. I made myself a cup of tea and glanced toward the window. The snow was falling harder now, soft, endless, quiet. Somewhere out there, a stranger was wearing my boots, warm for the first time in who knows how long. It shouldn't have mattered, but it did. I slept deeper than I had in years that night. Maybe kindness does that. Maybe it settles something restless inside you. Morning brought light through the window, pale and gentle. I stretched, still half dreaming, before noticing something by the door. A pair of boots. My boots. They were standing neatly on the mat, cleaner than I'd ever managed to make them, the scuffs polished away. Wrapped around them was a piece of paper, folded once. My hands trembled as I picked it up. The note was written in tidy handwriting I didn't recognize. "Thank you for saving my soul." That was all it said. No name, no address. Just those 6 words, simple, quiet, impossible. I pressed the note to my chest and stood there for what felt like forever. You ever have a moment when you realize life is trying to tell you something? That's what it felt like, as if all those years of giving and not being seen had come back in a single, strange act of grace. I didn't know then how much that small act would change everything. But looking back now, I can tell you it was that morning, that frozen bench, that man that saved me. I must have read that little note a dozen times. Thank you for saving my soul. It sat on my kitchen table, next to the boots I had given away, polished like new. Every time I looked at them, I felt something shift inside me, something small but alive. You know that feeling when you think maybe the world still notices you even just a little? That's what it was. All day I went about my chores, washing the dishes, folding the same old towel 3 times over, but my thoughts kept circling back to that man. Who was he? Why leave the boots like that? By evening, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I thought maybe Clara might want to hear. Maybe this would be the story that brought us closer again, something simple and good between us. A mother and daughter finding each other through kindness. Silly, isn't it? How hope still creeps in even after years of silence. So I packed my handbag, slipped the folded note inside, and caught the 7 o'clock train to her house. The city looked colder than ever, buildings sharp against the orange dusk, everyone moving fast, eyes down. I wondered if anyone noticed the people sitting alone, the way I had noticed him. Clara's street was tidy, lined with polished cars and bright door wreaths. Her house gleamed with the kind of warmth that money buys. I stood there for a moment before knocking, smoothing my coat, brushing away a speck of snow. When she opened the door, she looked surprised, not unhappy exactly, just uncertain. "Mom, what are you doing here? You should have called." "I know, love," I said. "I just wanted to see you. I've got something to tell you." She hesitated a second, then stepped aside. "All right, come in. But we're just about to have dinner, so make it quick." The smell of roasted chicken filled the room. Her husband, Mark, barely glanced up from his phone as I walked in. Their little living room looked spotless, too spotless, without a trace of laughter. I sat quietly at the edge of a soft chair. Clara poured me tea and asked, "So, what's this all about?" I smiled, holding out the note like something precious. "It's going to sound strange, but yesterday, I gave my boots to a man sitting in the park. It was freezing, Clara. He didn't even have shoes on. And then this morning, look." I showed her the note. "He must have brought them back. He cleaned them. He wrote this." She glanced at the note briefly, her lips tightening. "Mom, you gave your boots to some homeless man?" "He wasn't. Well, I don't think he was. He looked like someone who'd lost his way. I just couldn't walk past." Mark chuckled without lifting his gaze from the phone. "You'll give away your coat next, won't you? Typical." Clara shot him a look, then turned back to me.
"Mom, honestly.
You can't keep doing things like this. You're too trusting. Remember that time you lent money to Mrs. Feller and never saw it again?" That was years ago, I said softly. I just wanted to help. Yes, and where does it leave you now? She snapped, louder than she probably meant to. Always struggling, always taken advantage of. It's exhausting, Mum. Her words landed like small stones, sharp, deliberate. I tried to laugh it off. Oh, come on, it's not that bad. But then, as I glanced at her wrist, something caught my eye. A familiar glint. The silver bracelet. The one I sold to pay for her first term's books. I knew every little engraving on it by heart, because I'd had it made when she was 16, a birthday she barely remembered now. You bought it back, I said quietly. The bracelet. She glanced down and shrugged.
Yes.
It's pretty, isn't it? Mark found one just like it online. I nodded slowly, staring at my hands. So, it wasn't the same one. Or maybe it was, and she just didn't want to say. Either way, my chest tightened. Something about the moment made me feel smaller than ever. Mark looked up briefly. Clara, is your mom always like this? Honestly, Margaret, you should stop making yourself a charity case. No one respects that. The words hit harder than I expected. For a moment, the air in the room froze. Even Clara didn't challenge him. She just sat there, eyes down, letting the silence settle. I didn't come here to cause trouble, I whispered. I just thought you might want to hear something good. That's all. Clara sighed, tired, impatient. Mom, please. The world doesn't work the way you think it does. You can't just go around giving everything away and expecting people to be kind back. The only thing that matters is looking after yourself. No one cares how kind you are if you've got nothing to show for it. There it was, the line that cut deeper than all the rest. The only thing that matters is looking after yourself. I felt something inside me crumble a little then. All those years I had believed the opposite. That love meant giving until it hurt, that family meant sacrifice, and now my own daughter stood before me saying the world no longer needed hearts like mine. I wanted to tell her that kindness had saved someone that night, maybe even saved me, though she'd never understand it. But I swallowed the words. The rest of dinner blurred by in politeness that tasted bitter. When it was time to leave, she kissed my cheek out of habit and said, "Try to be sensible, Mom." On the train ride home, the city lights blurred into gold streaks against the windows. I held the folded note in my hand, reading it again and again until the ink smudged. Thank you for saving my soul. Tears came quietly this time. Not loud or dramatic, just quiet. You're welcome, I whispered into the glass. But who's going to save mine? That night, I left the boots by the door again. The world outside was still cold, but somehow I felt it less. Because somewhere between love and pain, a part of me had finally begun to wake up, a part no one could take back. The moment I closed the train door and pressed my forehead to the glass, the city's glow outside blurred into a memory I wasn't ready to face. Chapter 3 had left me standing on a platform of truths I'd long avoided, the ache of a wound that never fully healed, the risk of losing what mattered most, and a daughter who spoke in hard, clean lines that cut through my heart like winter air. I kept my pace low as I walked from the station to the little café where I'd meet the memory I'd spent years trying to outrun. The bell above the door tinkled softly as I entered, and the warmth wrapped around me like a patient hand. Behind the counter, Mrs. Delgado wore her customary smile, the kind that says even the worst days can be sweetened with a cup of tea and a listening ear. Somewhere in the back room, a phone hummed to life. I heard it, faint at first, then louder, almost as if the device was speaking to me directly. It wasn't the old landline in my kitchen at home. It was a number I knew too well, a line I'd sworn I'd never pick up again. In the seat near the window, a man I hadn't expected waited. Easy to miss in the bustle, but unmistakable once you'd seen him, a figure wearing the same quiet confidence I'd noticed in the park, the same suit, the same unsettling calm. He sat with hands folded, a slight tilt of the head that suggested patience, or perhaps calculation. The look in his eyes wasn't warmth. It was purpose, and it carried the weight of someone who knew how to wait. The message came in a whisper as if someone else were delivering it for him, a voice over my shoulder. a reminder of the lie that had become my shield, the one I'd pretended was mercy. "Margaret," he said, though I hadn't heard the name spoken aloud in years. "We should talk. It would be unwise to ignore what you've started." I didn't need to look around to know who he was, or at least who he pretended to be, a passively malevolent presence, a facilitator of discomfort, the kind of person who thrives on the social weight of other people's missteps. He was an enabler of the past, the one who profits by keeping old wounds unstitched, stitching them again and again into a pattern that never heals. The first instinct was to rise, to walk out, to let the door swing shut on the word talk, as if it were a joke. But something in me wanted to prove to the night that I wouldn't be dragged back into a performance of someone else's design. I gathered the courage to stay, and what followed felt like a slow, deliberate exhale of air I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The man across from me leaned in just a fraction, enough to press the idea that I could still be dragged into the old theater if I let him dictate the script. He spoke of consequences, the reputational cost of deviating from the story I'd given the world, the rumor mills that grind hardest when vulnerability is mistaken for weakness. He named names, or rather the specters of them. Colleagues, neighbors, the old circle that thrives on certainty, the certainty that I could be trusted to reframe kindness as naivety, as a liability, as a secret that would ruin the careful image I'd cultivated. "People forget the why," he said softly, as if reminding me not to forget the breadcrumbs that led to this moment. "They remember the results. If you continue to live with the truth you chose yesterday, they'll forget you tomorrow. If you revert, they'll praise you for being practical, for protecting what you've built." The threat was not a loud explosion, but a quiet, surgical cut. A reminder that truth has a price, and that price is paid in social currency. The same currency I'd once traded for the quiet dignity of keeping a house and a routine. The world loves a good story, especially one that confirms what it already believes about you. I asked for water, the simplest possible need, and the glass trembled in my hand as I watched the condensation bead and slip down the side. He watched the tremor too, timing his next words with the slow pulse in my throat. "Let's be honest," he finally said. "You're not the same woman you were when you started this. People change, Margaret. They regress or they rise. The real question is which version you want to be remembered as." And there it was, the seed of a choice. Not a grand confrontation, not a dramatic declaration, but a choice to retreat. To retreat from the café, retreat from a future that might require me to defend the simple truth that I chose over easy convenience. The retreat wasn't cowardice. It was a calculation. If I stayed and pushed back, it could become a war, one where the cost wouldn't just be my reputation. It would be the metaphorical life I'd been living for so long. I rose, steadied my breath, and felt the resolve solidify in a way it hadn't for years. I would not let this man, this passive antagonist who thrived on social leverage, pull me back into a role I'd already started to outgrow. Not today. Not here. As I stepped toward the door, a final hiss of sound escaped the room, the kind of sound that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The enabler's voice followed me, a soft intrusion in the small space between us. "Remember, Margaret, the lie has its own gravity. It can be strong enough to pull you back without you ever realizing you're being reeled in." Outside, the air bit at my cheeks, a reminder that the world waits with open arms for those who return to old patterns. The neon sign above the café door hummed in defiance, casting a pale, impatient light. My feet moved, not with the ease of habit, but with the stubborn energy of someone who had just learned to say no to a story that wasn't hers to tell. The walk home was quiet, the city's noise a distant murmur. My thoughts kept circling back to Clara, to Chapter 3's hard lines spoken with the weight of a life's worth of belief. If I stood still, I'd be complicit in my own erasure. If I moved, perhaps I could begin to write a different ending, one where truth isn't a weapon wielded by others, but a compass I held firmly in my own hands. Back at the apartment, I found the note still tucked in my pocket, the edges worn from being read and reread. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where kindness didn't come with a price tag attached to my name. But the threat wasn't finished. A message pinged on my phone. A single line, clipped, efficient, almost affectionate in its coldness. You will return to the lie, or the lie will return you to a place you won't survive. The words burned in my chest like a cold flame, searing away the last of the hesitation. I stood there in the doorway, boots still by the door from the night's earlier steps, and I understood something with startling clarity. The immediate aftermath wasn't about the truth being spoken or protected. It was about choosing a path that would either bear the weight of a life lived for others or collapse under the weight of a reputation that would never be mine to bear again. I turned away from the door, not toward the phone that held the threat, but toward the quiet corner of the living room where a photo of my late husband used to sit. The sight of his face reminded me of the days when the world felt larger, when a simple act of care could bloom into a life that mattered beyond the kitchen table. A soft breath escaped me, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to think about him not as a memory to defend, but as a partner who taught me to keep faith with the person I truly wanted to be. If the price of truth was social ruin, maybe the cost of losing that truth would be even higher. The person I'd become if I chose to live without it. That's a debt I refuse to pay again. I didn't call Clara. I didn't tell her I'd changed my mind about coming back to the lie. I didn't answer the enabler's calls. Instead, I did something small but decisive. I opened the window, let the winter air rush in, and sat with the cold until it slowed and settled into a kind of quiet courage. In that quiet, I began to map the next steps. Not grand gestures, but deliberate, careful ones. I would need to confront the memory that kept calling me back to the old theater, to the old audience. I would need to guard the new truth I was already forming, that perhaps the world could witness the tenderness of a simple act without demanding a ledger of consequences. That maybe, just maybe, kindness could stand on its own, unbothered by the crowd's verdict. The evening closed with the soft ticking of the clock and the soft, steady breath of a woman who had decided to walk away from a lie and toward a life where the price of being true wasn't a reputation, but the chance to live with dignity again. Morning came gently, as if the world was trying not to startle me. The frost had silvered the windows again, though the sun behind it was warmer than it had been in days. Maybe it was just my eyes that made it look that way. Maybe I was simply ready to see light again. There was a silence in the apartment that day that didn't feel heavy. Not the hushed guilt that follows a sleepless night. This one had rhythm, a kind of steadiness, like the pause between two heartbeats. Everything from the kettle to the ticking clock felt almost like ceremony. When I finally looked at my phone, 3 messages glowed on the screen. All from him, the enabler. Each one short, all edged in politeness that wasn't polite at all. Margaret, ignoring my advice could cost you dearly. You've built a reputation for grace. Don't let sentiment ruin it. Last warning, people are beginning to talk. I didn't reply, just deleted them one by one. There was something freeing in watching the words vanish, as if a door somewhere had quietly clicked shut behind me. I decided then that if the world wanted to whisper, it could whisper to itself. Instead, I bundled in my coat and went outside. The air bit at my cheeks, and the light stretched pale over the park. The same bench was still there, half hidden under drifted snow. For a long moment, I stood across from it, half expecting to see him again, the man with the quiet eyes and the frost-bitten hands. But the bench was empty. Still, I walked over and brushed the snow off the slats before sitting down, as if saving the space mattered somehow. The cold seeped through my coat, but it was a clean cold, the kind that wakes you up, not the kind that punishes. That's when I noticed it, a sealed envelope beneath the bench. My heart kicked. The handwriting was the same, tidy, deliberate. To the woman who gives warmth even to the wind. Inside, there was no note this time, only a small pressed flower, a winter violet, thin as memory. And below it, a business card. Alexander W. Stone, founder Aurelian Trust. The name meant nothing to me then. But the way it sat on that fine white card, embossed, measured, it didn't belong to anyone homeless. It belonged to someone with reach. I stared at the card so long my fingers went numb. Around me, the park moved at its usual pace. Joggers, mothers, children tossing bits of bread to the pigeons. But for the first time, all of it felt connected. It struck me that maybe what had happened wasn't random. Maybe he'd been looking for something that night. Not help, but a kind of proof. That thought alone sparked something in me, something stubborn and alive. For weeks, people had told me who to be, what version of myself to return to. But this tiny, wild act, sitting on this bench, holding a clue I hadn't asked for, felt like my own quiet rebellion. My small breakthrough. When I got home, I searched his name online. The first result made me whisper out loud. Aurelian Trust, Global Housing Initiative. Founder, Alexander W. Stone. Net worth undisclosed, known for anonymity and philanthropy. A billionaire. I sat back in my chair, the world swaying a little around me. The kettle clicked off behind me, but I didn't move to pour. All the noise, all the threats, Clara's hard words, the enabler's voice, they seemed to fall away in a slow collapse. I pressed the business card against my chest, heartbeat to heartbeat, and for the first time, I didn't feel foolish for believing that kindness mattered, because maybe, just maybe, the proof was sitting right there in my palm. That night, as the wind curled around the building, a thought came to me, quiet but sure. Sometimes, what feels like a retreat is just the world tilting you toward the truth. I didn't know what would come next, a reward, a reckoning, or both, but something inside me had realigned. And in that delicate alignment, I felt it, the whisper of purpose I thought I'd lost years ago. It happened on a Wednesday morning, the quiet kind that hides storms beneath it. The kettle hissed, the post slid through the slot with a soft whump, and for a moment life seemed almost safe again. I stood by the window, watching a neighbor brush frost from her car. It was one of those ordinary scenes that makes you think the world might finally be still, until you look down and realize the letter in your hand has weight. The envelope was cream, edged neatly, with no return address. Only my name written in sharp, expensive ink. Margaret Ellison. Something about the handwriting made my stomach tighten, not because I recognized it, but because it didn't fit in my world. It belonged to someone who owned boardrooms and black cars, not someone who spent mornings making tea and folding laundry twice to fill the silence. I slipped a knife under the flap and unfolded the paper. It wasn't a letter.
It was a contract.
At the top, in cold print, non-compete and confidentiality agreement, Aurelian Trust. I blinked, reading the words again. Beneath the formal legalese, the message was clear. I was bound, apparently bound since 5 years ago, to a non-disclosure clause signed under my maiden name. Attached was a copy of my signature. Except I had never seen this document before. The date on it made my knees weaken. December 18th, 5 years earlier, the same week my husband fell ill, when I was drowning in hospital forms and old debts. Somewhere in that chaos, it seemed, someone had slipped this paper into a pile of documents I'd signed in desperation. The language was ruthless. It named me as a consultant of charitable development services under a small subsidiary, a name I didn't recognize. Hidden clause by hidden clause, it tied me to obligations I had never knowingly accepted. I was legally prohibited from publishing, profiting, or disclosing any information relating to the operations, donors, or beneficiaries of the Aurelian Trust. Even worse, violation entitled the trust to seize equal financial restitution derived from reputational harm. The phrase sounded elegant and meaningless until I read the number proposed beneath it. £142,000. It might as well have been a mountain. Below the signatures, one name burned through me like acid. Mark Rennett, Legal Director, Aurelian Trust.
Mark.
Clara's husband. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Pieces began stitching themselves together. The sneers, the threats, the cryptic messages about reputation. He hadn't just mocked me at dinner. He'd been building a cage years before that night, layering legality over deceit until it looked clean. The letter accompanying the contract was written on sleek letterhead. Ms. Ellison, we remind you of your ongoing legal obligations under the non-compete and confidentiality agreement, effective December 18, 2020. Please be advised that any contact with Mr. Alexander W. Stone, including but not limited to correspondence, discussion, or acceptance of personal gifts, may constitute a breach under Section 4 of the contract. We strongly advise compliance to prevent escalation to legal enforcement. Regards, Rennett and Greaves LLP. My hands went cold. The letter fluttered to the floor. So that was the trap. The kindness that had once saved Clara's life through her education, the paperwork I signed when I transferred what little savings I had been rerouted through his company. He had bought my good deed and wrapped it in legality until I could never speak of it again. And now, it seemed, he wanted to use it to silence me, to stop me from even knowing who Alexander Stone truly was. I leaned against the kitchen counter, heart wild and uneven. The question came without mercy, steady as a ticking clock. How much control have I already surrendered? Had every act of kindness been turned into leverage without my seeing it? Was every form I'd ever signed a thread in someone else's loom? The phone rang. I didn't need to check who it was to feel the dread coil in my chest. The enabler's voice came smooth, almost kind. "You see, Margaret," he said. "Everything is already set in motion. You don't even have to fight. Just step back, stay silent. It's safer that way." He paused just long enough to let the silence become a signature. "You see, love, the thing about truth is, legally speaking, it belongs to whoever files it first." Then the line went dead. I crumpled to the floor, clutching the contract that claimed my own life's choices in black and white ink. The edges sliced against my palms, but I didn't feel it. Outside, the snow began again, thin flakes drifting sideways under a gray sky. And somewhere between the sound of the kettle beginning to whine and the echo of that voice, I understood. This wasn't an argument anymore. It was a war I hadn't known I was already losing. I didn't sleep that night. The legal papers sat on the table like a silent witness, their neat paragraphs crawling with invisible hands. Every word seemed designed to erase me politely. At 3 a.m, I poured black tea, no sugar, and read it again, line by line, clause by clause, until the shapes of the letters blurred. There it was in small print. Section 8, Power of Assignment. It meant anyone who held the parent company's signature held me. I'd signed away my autonomy, without even realizing it. But if Mark and his firm thought I'd crumble quietly, they hadn't learned much about the woman who sat barefoot in the snow and still walked home standing straight. By dawn, the city had turned amber. I packed the papers into an envelope and stepped outside. The morning air felt purposeful, the kind that wakes every nerve until life feels freshly cut. The frost on the pavement sparkled like tiny warnings, but I kept walking, one step after another, until I reached the only person who might know how to untie a trap built from kindness. Mrs. Delgado, from the café. 62 years old, sharp as vinegar, kind in ways that didn't melt into pity. She'd run a small accountancy for years before her joints gave out. If anyone could smell a buried clause, it was her. She poured me coffee and listened without interrupting as I laid out the contract, the threats, the letterhead, the name Aurelian Trust. Her eyes narrowed behind wire-frame glasses. When I finished, she exhaled slow and said, "They're not just silencing you, Margaret. They're protecting someone bigger." "Alexander Stone?" I asked. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe not directly. But this," she tapped a line mid-page. "This clause gives them license to act in his name while keeping him spotless. It's a shield. I've seen it before in corporate cleanups, charity fronts, tax havens, shadow subsidiaries. Someone wanted your signature to legitimize a transaction without leaving their own fingerprints." Her words landed like facts wrapped in thunder. "So," I said, voice trembling, "can they actually do this to me?" She looked at me long enough for silence to do the answering. "They already have," she said. "But that doesn't mean you can't tear it apart. You just need leverage." We worked for hours, tracing names through old receipts and emails I still had from my husband's illness. At the bottom of one forgotten folder was a bank transfer, small, anonymous, made exactly 1 day before the contract date. Source: Aurelian Development Fund. Mrs. Delgado's eyebrow shot up. "That's your proof someone paid for your signature. Not to you. Maybe insurance, maybe payoff. Whatever it is, if you attach this to a news outlet or a regulator." "No," I interrupted. Not yet. That's what they'd expect. They want to fight on their terms. She smiled thinly. So, what will you do? I sipped my now cold coffee. Find Alexander Stone. The next morning I walked into a marble tower bearing his name. People in tailored coats swept past as if time here cost more by the second. The receptionist looked me over, plain wool coat, careworn gloves, and her tone softened politely. Do you have an appointment, ma'am? No, I said. But tell him this. The woman who lent him her boots would like a word. For a second, something flickered across her face. Surprise, confusion, maybe recognition. She made a call, murmured something too low to hear. Then, please wait in the atrium. I sat beneath a wall of glass that caught the whole city in reflection. The farther I looked, the smaller I appeared inside it, a speck in someone else's empire. But then the elevator chimed, and a man stepped out. Not Alexander Stone. Someone younger, gray-suited, uncertain. Ms. Ellison? Yes. I'm Mr. Stone's associate. He's abroad. But he left instructions if you ever came here, give you this. He handed me a slim envelope and left before I could ask more. Inside, a single typed line. The truth you need is inside what you already signed. Start with the witness. Beneath it, a signature I felt rather than saw. A.W. Stone. The witness. I turned the original contract over. A.T. the bottom. Beside my forged signature, a witness's name appeared in faint gray sea. Run it. Clara. The paper trembled in my hands. For a full minute, I couldn't breathe enough to make sound. My daughter had witnessed the trap. Everything inside me went quiet at once. Not rage, not despair, just a silence sharp enough to slice through bone. If this was true, then she hadn't just stood by during my shaming. She'd helped set the snare that made it possible. Outside, sirens drifted faintly through the city air, but I barely heard them. The only sound I noticed was the scrape of my own chair as I stood, sliding the contract into my bag. So it wasn't just about reputation or debt anymore. It was blood deep. And as the building's glass doors closed behind me, one sentence followed, perfectly clear, echoing like a vow. The next move is mine. I stood at Clara's door for a long time before knocking. The contract in my bag felt heavier than stone, heavier than years of swallowed words. The afternoon light stretched thin across the neighborhood, the kind of light that finds its way into every truth you've tried to hide. When she opened the door, her smile flickered and fell away just as quickly. "Mom," she said flatly, "what are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I answered. My voice didn't shake this time. Inside, the same scent of polished surfaces and candle-waxed calm filled the air. Everything was perfect, too perfect, the kind of order that comes from fear of being seen. She gestured stiffly toward the couch. "You could have called." I placed the envelope between us. "You already know what this is." For a moment, silence thickened. Then her eyes darted to it, just once, and I saw it. The recognition, small but unmistakable. "I don't know what you mean," she said. I leaned forward. "Your name's on it, Clara. As the witness." She swallowed hard but didn't answer. Instead, she busied herself straightening a vase, her hands trembling just enough to betray her. "Why?" I whispered. "Why would you be part of this?" When she finally turned back to me, her eyes shone. Not with remorse, but with something brittle. "You don't understand how bad things were back then," she said. "Mark handled everything. The bills, the debt from Dad's hospital, the house. He said the paperwork was routine. He told me your signature just needed a witness and that I could help." I believed him. "Believed him," I echoed. "Even when it meant signing my life away?" "He said it would protect us."
"Protect you," she snapped.
"After everything you've done, giving away money, helping strangers, he thought this would stop you from being taken advantage of again. For once, you could be safe." I looked at my daughter. The same eyes I'd watched blinking against the light the day she was born, and it struck me how easily fear dresses itself in good intentions. "Safe," I said softly. "You call this safe, watching me lose what little freedom I had left?" She flinched. You never see it, do you? You never see what your kindness costs everyone else. That one cut deep. I stood slowly, every word now trembling with a steadier fire. You think goodness is weakness because it doesn't show up on a bank statement. You think love is wasted if there's nothing to gain from it. You sound just like him. Clara's jaw tightened. He's my husband. And he's your jailer, I said. The words landed between us like glass shattering. For a second, neither of us moved. Then, to my astonishment, Clara's eyes filled with tears. You don't know what he can do, she whispered. He said if I ever told you, he'd ruin you. Legally. Publicly. She backed away a step, voice cracking. He said everything was in his name now. Even the house. Even. She stopped herself, covering her mouth. Even what? I pressed. Her silence was answer enough. It wasn't just my contract. It was my husband's legacy. The house I'd fought to keep, the savings I'd scraped together. All of it funneled through his trust, twisted into leverage. I reached for her hand, but she pulled back, sobbing. I'm sorry, Mum, she said. I thought it would be temporary. But then Stone's people got involved, and Mark said if the truth came out, we'd both go down. So I just kept quiet. It was all I needed to hear. The daughter's lie wasn't built from hatred. It was built from fear, from years of living in the shadow of a man who used protection as a chain. I started toward the door. You don't have to defend him anymore, Clara. But I'm done being quiet. She looked up through tears. He'll destroy you if you do. I paused, hand on the door handle. Maybe. But that'll be his story, not mine. When I stepped outside, the wind had changed, sharper, alive. I could feel the cliff beneath my feet now, the drop between truth and ruin, but I'd stopped fearing the fall. Halfway down the street, my phone buzzed. The number was blocked. A single message appeared on the screen. You were warned. Now the law speaks for us. Attached was a digital copy of a summons. Aurelian Trust versus Margaret Ellison. The inked stamp of war. The first lawsuit. The ultimate betrayal formalized. And yet, as I stood under the gray sky clutching the phone, a strange calm took hold. Because for the first time, I knew exactly what I was fighting. The chapter ends with her raising her eyes toward the horizon, not broken, but resolved. The summons came printed on cold paper, thick enough to remind me that power often hides behind texture. It arrived folded neatly in a courier sleeve stamped Aurelian Trust versus Ellison, its words written in that same impersonal tone reserved for debt, eviction, and punishment. Mrs. Delgado read through it beside me, her finger tracing the paragraphs like surgical incisions. They're moving fast, she said quietly. They're claiming breach of confidentiality and defamation. That means someone's already leaked your name. I stared at the phrase breach of confidentiality. The law made it sound so tidy, as if kindness were a secret you could own. By noon my phone began to buzz nonstop. The story had exploded online. Local woman at center of Aurelian Trust dispute. No one mentioned I was the woman who'd given away her boots. They only said I was accused of compromising sensitive information belonging to a high-profile charity. I read the comments until my stomach twisted. Typical bleeding heart, one said. Always another sympathy act gone wrong. Another simply wrote, probably a scammer. I turned off the phone. The world had decided what I was before hearing a single word from me. In the afternoon, the solicitor I'd hired, a young woman named Amira Vale, met me in a small legal office that smelled of old coffee and printer ink. She spoke quickly, crisp vowels cutting through the noise in my head. They've filed under corporate statute, she said. It means this isn't about reputation alone. They're after your silence. If you back down and sign a non-disclosure settlement, they'll drop the charges. But if you fight, what happens if I fight? Amira looked straight at me. You'll lose everything on paper, but maybe not in truth. The honesty in her voice steadied me. A week later, the city courthouse turned into a stage. The banners outside bore the trust's golden emblem, a sunburst over open hands, irony written on marble. Inside, the room smelled of polished wood and expensive perfume. Across the aisle sat Margaret, expression smooth as lacquer, flanked by corporate lawyers whose cufflinks probably cost more than my rent. Clara wasn't beside him. When my name was called, knees trembling, I stood under the weight of fluorescent light. Mark met my eyes, half-smile barely visible. The gesture was small, but I understood its language perfectly. Checkmate before the game even starts. But something unexpected happened mid-proceeding. The back doors opened. A faint stir of camera flashes followed. A man stepped in, tall, deliberate, wearing no tie, just a coat the color of winter dusk. The murmurs started instantly. Alexander W. Stone. He took a seat at the back row, hands clasped, watching as if he'd been there all along. The world outside might have belonged to lawyers, but in that moment, the silence in the courtroom bent toward him. The judge cleared her throat. Proceed. Mark began listing his prepared charges, words like breach, malice, fabrication, slipping from his tongue with legal precision. But halfway through his statement, Stone raised a hand. Your Honor, he said softly. His voice carried like low thunder. I wish to intervene. Gasps rippled through the room. Even Mark faltered. The judge frowned. On what grounds? He placed a folder on the table before him. On the grounds that the trust you speak of is owned solely by me. And the woman standing there, he pointed straight toward me, did not breach anything. She fulfilled it. The room froze. Cameras clicked. He turned his gaze to Mark, and though his tone stayed calm, the power in it made even the walls seem to draw closer. I created the Aurelian Trust to test integrity, he said. To see who would act with compassion without reward, who would not be coerced into self-interest. Ms. Ellison's actions are the reason the trust still has meaning at all. He paused. But somewhere, my ideals were repurposed into a corporation that values compliance over conscience. Mark began to protest, but the judge raised a hand for silence. Alexander Stone stepped forward and handed over a single signed document, request for full audit of Aurelian Trust entities. The same corporate web Mark had used to entrap me was now being legally peeled back by its founder. The hearing was adjourned amid chaos, reporters outside, murmurs of scandal, flashes bouncing against courthouse glass. As I stepped into the cold, Amira turned to me. That man just detonated the entire case. You realize what this means? I nodded slowly. It means the truth just became too big to hide. But beneath that thought ran another, sharper one. A question I couldn't shake. If Alexander Stone had known everything, if he could have stopped it sooner, why didn't he? Because some part of this, the lawsuit, the exposure, felt orchestrated, as if even my suffering had been part of a larger design. And for the first time, I wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or afraid. The last image of the chapter. Margaret standing on the courthouse steps, snow beginning to fall again, a dozen microphones pointed at her face, and behind the wall of cameras, Alexander Stone watching quietly, unreadable. The courthouse smelled of stale coffee and anticipation. Overnight, it had become something halfway between a battlefield and a theater, microphones blooming outside like spring weeds. Inside, reporters waited for the day's proceedings, whispering headlines before they happened. I sat between Amira and Mrs. Delgado, both calm in their own ways, one sharp, one steady. Across the aisle, Mark looked thinner, unshaven. Power sits badly when stripped of its audience. Clara wasn't there again. Maybe shame had finally drawn its curtains. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The sound of chairs scraping against marble echoed like a storm gathering distance. Alexander Stone arrived last, silent, tailored, every step deliberate. He didn't look at me right away. His gaze moved over the room as if measuring the temperature of deceit. Then, finally, his eyes met mine, and something in them softened. The first half of the hearing unspooled as expected, statements, audits, counterarguments. The trust's own ledgers had cracked open overnight, revealing trails of hidden payments, charity funds rerouted into offshore holdings, falsified signatures, and contracts made under duress. Amira presented each page like a surgeon disassembling a machine. These, she said, holding up a stack of files, Our accounts authorized by Mr. Rennett and verified by a witness, his wife, Mrs. Clara Rennett. They show deliberate misappropriation of funds under the guise of operational secrecy. The courtroom rippled with murmurs. For the first time, Mark lowered his gaze. Then Alexander Stone stood up. He moved to the center aisle, not towards the judge, but toward me. When I founded the Aurelian Trust, he said, I wanted to build a system that rewarded quiet integrity, not showmanship. We called them invisible hands, people whose compassion worked in silence. We kept their names private to protect them. But lately, my trust became something else, an industry that purchased virtue, like a stock. He turned toward the panel. Ms. Ellison was chosen 5 years ago because she'd once helped me in ways she never realized, long before I had wealth. When I was a student, homeless for 3 months, the food she donated at the shelter kept me alive. Her name on that logbook inspired the program we later designed, the very one that now stands corrupted before you. A stunned hush fell across the room. I stared at him, heart pounding. The night on the park bench flashed in my mind, his face shadowed by cold, that quiet voice. It's colder somewhere else. It had been him all along. He went on, voice steady, but rimmed with something fragile. When I recognized her name on the trust's roster, I wanted to repay a debt, to see if kindness could still exist in a world built on profit. So, yes, I tested her. She gave her boots without knowing she was walking straight into the center of my experiment. He turned toward the judge. And for that, I owe her an apology, not just for what she suffered, but for believing that human decency needed to be proven at all. Gasps, camera clicks, the sound of 100 stories changing shape mid-sentence. Amira leaned toward me, whispering, "This flips the narrative. He's admitting control. It absolves you legally." But I barely heard her. My pulse rang loud. He'd orchestrated everything. The rescue, the ruin, the test dressed as chance. I wasn't a random act of grace in a stranger's life. I was the hypothesis of a billionaire playing God with guilt and philanthropy. I stood before the judge could speak. "May I?" The judge nodded. My voice came out raw but steady. "You say you chose me to prove kindness still existed," I said, eyes locked on Stone's. "But what did you prove? That power still decides whose pain is valid? That goodness needs permission to matter? You talk about integrity as if it's data, a thing to measure. But for people like me, it's the only thing we have left." The room held its breath. Stone didn't flinch, but his eyes, those calm, relentless eyes, flickered with recognition. "I deserved better than to be your experiment," I said. "And so did everyone your trust used to hide greed." The judge cleared her throat. "Please, Miss Ellison." But she didn't stop me. "Kindness," I said finally, "doesn't need witnesses or audits or empires. It just needs courage." After my statement, nothing felt the same. The judge announced a recess. Lawyers conferred in whispers. Amira pressed my hand. "That speech will echo everywhere," she said. "It's your freedom, Margaret." When I stepped outside the courthouse, the snow had stopped. The cameras waited, hungry for reactions. I said nothing, just held the paper the judge had handed me. Case dismissed, pending audit completion. It wasn't victory. It was pause. Because behind the courthouse crowd, I caught sight of Alexander Stone again, standing apart, watching as if weighing whether redemption ever balances against guilt. He gave a small nod. Apology or farewell, I couldn't tell. Then he turned and disappeared into a waiting car. As the reporters shouted my name, I realized they finally knew who I was, and yet they didn't know me at all. The only words that mattered were the ones I whispered to myself, soft against the cold. The truth doesn't need a verdict. It just needs to survive. And for the first time, that felt enough. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Voice of Jenna so you never miss the next chapter in our world of twists, lessons, and unforgettable moments. Your support means the world to me, and trust me, the stories only get better from here.